Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of MedTech POV, a podcast brought to you by AdvaMed, the MedTech Association, the world's largest trade organization for medical technology companies. I'm your host, Scott Whitaker, President and CEO of AdvaMed. And today we're pleased to have with us former United States Senator Richard Burr, who I've known for quite a while now. Through nearly 3 decades serving North Carolina in both houses of Congress, Senator Burr became a well-regarded expert in healthcare policy. And as chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he also became a widely respected expert in national security. In both arenas, his list of legislative and policy accomplishments is long, which is why it's great to have him on the podcast to talk in particular about healthcare and medtech, the world he knows so well. Senator Burr, great to have you at MedTech POV.
Scott, good to be in this new studio.
Yeah.
And more importantly, to talk about the great things that are going on.
Yeah, we appreciate all you've done and your time on the Hill and your leadership there as well. I have to ask you, do you miss it at all?
You know, to miss it, you have to look back at it. I haven't looked back yet.
Yeah.
I think that you and I are probably in agreement that the next 10 years could be the most exciting time of our life as technology and healthcare intersect.
Yeah.
And so there's no reason to look back at what either I did in Washington or what they're doing today. It's really how do we prepare them for what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. So before we look to the future, I'm going to go ahead and look back a little bit with you anyhow, if that's okay.
Yeah.
A lot of folks here probably have seen you before on TV or knew about your time in the Senate, but they might not know about your upbringing, kind of where you came from and your path to D.C. So maybe we could start there. Where'd you grow up and what led you to D.C.?
Yeah, born in Charlottesville, Virginia, so I'm a Virginian at heart. My dad actually came out of seminary school, and he was the chaplain at UVA and lived on the lawn before he was married and had kids. But I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Growing up the son of a minister, you would think that that's a tough role. Growing up in any community back then, every parent knew whose child that was. So It wasn't because my dad was a minister and everybody knew him, but if you did something wrong, people called your parents and told them.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest difference. I look back on my life and realize that it wasn't just my parents' impact on me as parenting, but it was the community's impact on me. It made you distinguish between right and wrong at a very early age. And
Right.
Let's say I think that's something we've lost.
Yeah, yeah. Then you decided you're going to go to college, play a little football, I think, right, didn't you?
Had life's ambition to go back to UVA and play football, and Sonny Randall had just become the new coach, and Sonny was not an easy guy to like, and I ended up signing with Wake Forest.
Yeah, and how did that go for you?
I look back on it, and a college athletic career is, 1, an education, and 2, it's an opportunity to make lifetime friends.
Yeah.
I keep both of those.
Yeah.
Professional sports was never in my future. And I might say, as an addition to this is what scares the hell out of me on the name, image, and likeness issue, is that we're changing college sports to resemble almost pay-per-view.
Yeah.
And the truth is that women's sports is going to be hurt, but more importantly, kids are going to have the experience, and it's, to them, all going to be about who pays the bigger price tag.
Yeah.
That's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, it is. It is. We could spend a whole separate podcast talking about NIL and the impact it had. I played basketball in college, not well, but for a couple years at the D2 level. And D2 looks a little bit more like D1 probably did when you were playing at Wake Forest now.
It does. And listen, the one thing that we're learning is there are a lot of athletically talented kids. Yeah. Not all of them are going to get paid, but all of them can compete. Mm-hmm. And the challenging thing is that to see what the conferences do about inclusion of the smaller D1s and whether D2s have an opportunity in the future to become D1s.
I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but for me, I'd learned more lessons playing team sports, particularly in college, about leadership and teamwork and goals than probably anything else I really learned about in college, to be fair. And those things really have stuck with me, and you must have the same experience as you've grown as a leader, not only in this town, but before it.
Yeah, and I think it really came into reality how important that team approach was in COVID.
Right.
When all of a sudden everybody was dislocated, they were working at different locations, and you had to find ways to connect, not dissimilar to what we experienced as athletes when you had challenging times. you needed to maintain that connective tissue with folks.
Yep.
And I think that made it easier for me to understand.
Yeah. When did you decide that you wanted to enter politics and make the run to D.C.?
Well, I was taking a second grader and a third grader to school one morning listening to NPR about our good friend Bush #1.
Yeah.
And the deal he cut out at Andrews Air Force Base to raise taxes to balance the federal budget. And he'd promised not to do that.
Right.
Wasn't the first time we'd heard we were going to raise taxes to balance the federal budget. And the fact is they never balanced the federal budget. And as a business guy, I said, that's it. Drove home, rode up the driveway, walked in the door, looked at my wife, said, I'm going to run for Congress. Got back in the car, never mentioned another word for 6 months until I signed up.
Yeah.
My wife's never let me forget it.
And so you came in with the Gingrich Revolution, didn't you? Right around that time?
Came in,
Yeah.
we all had 7 heads, according to the press. But we did accomplish one thing. Under Newt's leadership and our new control of the House for the first time in 50-some years, we did balance the budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I look back, and looking back really doesn't help, but when I look back, if it hadn't have been for 9/11, we would probably have a balanced budget today.
That's really interesting. Talk about Newt and his leadership. He, in some respects, has become a little bit of a lightning rod from time to time, but what he did in garnering the support of the entire caucus, creating a wave election like that, and then leading through a challenging time with the president who was not unpopular when he was elected, but unpopular about halfway through, right? And still managed to get a lot of things done. I'm not sure he gets enough credit for his leadership during that time.
Newt is a dynamic thinker.
Yeah.
He throws a lot of things on the wall to see what sticks, and then strategically chooses the things that, one, had a huge impact on the American people, and two, politically were advantageous, and I think he leveraged that into a lot of change. I think you're right. He will not get the credit that he's due, but I'm not sure, Scott, that any speaker in the future is going to get credit for anything other than a title that they had for a small amount of time. Social media has changed the world. It's changed Washington. And I might say Newt accomplished everything that he did without social media.
Yeah.
That's the more amazing thing, is that he found a way to connect with the people across the country. And if you remember back, it can all be traced back to what he put in TV Guide about the contract with America. And it's hard for us to envision today that there's any publication that all the American people would read that would have the same similar impact. And I think many of us then question, was TV Guide actually the right tool?
Right.
And it ended up being.
Wow, that's fascinating. I don't remember that, actually. That was the primary source.
That was the
of
primary source of the
contract with America, is where
Exactly.
he kind of rolled it out.
Yep.
Isn't that something? And now there basically is no TV Guide anymore.
There is no media.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to have journalists. We still do. They're getting laid off faster than any sector in the economy. And the problem that exists is that if any news source covers a story now, whether they're legit or whether they're not, whether they're nation-state controlled or independent, then all of a sudden that comes with it a stamp of factual, when in fact malign influence here and abroad is going to be the function of nation-states that want to disrupt our economy, want to disrupt our politics.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll talk about 2024 and elections before this podcast is over. But that's going to be a very challenging thing to see as this year plays out.
Yeah. If you look back over the course of your long career and impressive career in D.C., it feels like to the average viewer that the partisanship has gotten much, much worse, that it's hyper-partisan now. If you look at 92, you look at 2000, and then you work your way up to where we are today, how much of that is perception and how much of it is reality based on your time in Congress?
Listen, I think up to about 5 years ago, there was still 80% of Congress somewhere from right of center to left of center.
Yeah.
And then the fringe were 10 and 10, 10 on the far left, 10 on the far right. But we functioned in that 80% category. Today, the fringe has grown. And I'm not exactly sure what the middle is. I'm not sure that the middle gets to 50 today. That makes it very difficult to try to figure out how you do an initiative that is big.
Yep.
I still revert to the belief that as a member of the Senate, I knew what the threshold was. If I didn't have 60 votes,
Right.
then I couldn't move an initiative that was important to me and that I thought was important to the American people. So it forced me on day one to, one, find a person on the other side of the aisle as a sponsor, and two, to find somebody that I knew when the bullets started flying, they were still going to be with me.
Yeah.
That's why I partnered with people like John Dingell and Anna Eshoo and Barbara Mikulski, names we all remember.
Yep.
I'm not sure that those people exist right now. And I think that's what makes it difficult. The other thing I would tell you is that there seems to be a very low interest to learn on Capitol Hill today.
Yeah.
And that scares me going forward, because as everything gets more complicated, as we integrate technology into healthcare and technology into every aspect of our lives, it's discomforting to believe that AI policy is going to be written by people that don't even spend the time to figure out what AI is. I had the great pleasure of having John Dingell on the Energy and Commerce Committee, where he or his dad had written the legislation for 40 years. And John understood every facet of those bills. And he sat me down and he said, take my advice, learn the issues and you're going to be dangerous. And the truth is, it's really hard to find people that really understand these technical issues like we used to.
Yeah. There's no doubt about it. From where we sit, we see that oftentimes too. And it feels frustrating at times when you're trying to move good policy that has literally no partisan impact one way or the other.
Yeah, and the formula for moving it is still passion and knowledge. But it's hard to find one individual that holds both of them.
Yeah.
Because we've either let down on the knowledge side by teaching them, or we don't have the passion that you need. You really have to be passionate about an issue to move from one Congress to the next Congress, because you know you got to start over again.
Yeah. Is there a path back, Senator? Oftentimes you hear people say, well, if we had the right president, right, if we had the right leader, we could get back to a day where bipartisanship led us to solutions. Is it a lot more complicated than that?
I think it's a lot more complicated because it's no longer solely about leadership. And Scott, I think the challenging thing is that an industry or a company in the past could drive a message and drive an issue and make the case. The voice is no longer loud enough. And I know I'm trying to figure out what combination of entities do you need to put together? Is it business and academia? Does that thrust enough of a voice to get members of Congress to listen and move? We'll figure it out. But I'm also convinced that we have to approach things differently on Capitol Hill than we have in the past, that there's no single shot that you can take for success.
Right.
And that compels me to sit with every initiative that I'm looking at and that I'm advising people on, and I wrap it around into not only an education process, but a communications process. I look for thought leaders that can contribute in op-eds and podcasts and other things to support a legislative initiative. When I look back over my 28 years, I'm not sure that I can remember a time where we used all the ammunition on one thing.
Right.
But I think we're there now where it takes that.
Yeah. I want to come back to policy in a little more depth as we go on. But before we leave politics entirely, let's look out to the next election, presidential election primarily. I know you can't predict what's going to happen, but it sure looks like a rematch of Biden-Trump again. I'll ask a two-part question.
Sure.
Is there a path that neither of them run or one of them doesn't become the primary candidate, in your opinion? And then secondly, what's this election look like to you?
Well, I'm a big one about trends. And if you look at the trend line right now, you've got two choices this fall, Biden and Trump. I know that there are people and organizations that are talking about third-party candidates. You can't historically look at the U.S. system and say there's a pathway for a third-party candidate to win.
Right.
There may be a pathway for a third party to influence the outcome, but I would tell you we've reached a point, I think, that the lineup on one side and the other is so big that the impact is potentially to get to the end of the election process, nobody get the electoral votes that they need, and then the House of Representatives choose who's president. I personally believe that the American people would be outraged. One, if they knew that that was the way it's set up, or two, if it happened.
Right.
And we don't seem to see the parties recognize that that could be the scenario.
Right.
So we'll have to watch to see if both leaders right now end up being the candidates come June, July, August with conventions. And more importantly, whether there's any fire that happens under somebody else that gives us reason to pause and say, oh gosh, we might be in that first scenario of a House really in power.
Yeah, I can't imagine if that happens, how disruptive that would be, right?
Well, it would be, and we have to also remember that from a timing standpoint, you elect a new Congress
Right.
in the 1st of January. You don't inaugurate a president until the third week of January. So,
Right.
so it would be the new House of Representatives that decided the next president,
Yeah,
not the current
that's
one.
crazy to think about. And given that, right, let's think out a little bit about the new House, right? What are the trends look like to you in the House right now and the Senate right now as well? Who do you think is most likely to control both bodies?
I think the Senate, again, looking at trends, the Senate will likely switch hands. And I think it would take something really out of the ordinary and unexpected for that trend to change. The House is going to end up, one way or the other, somewhere between 4 and 8 votes with a majority, meaning that somebody's going to end up with a very, very small majority, susceptible to exactly what we've seen, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, where small bands of members can hold hostage leadership and can hold hostage legislation. I don't think that you can today look at the House of Representatives and with any certainty predict which side of the aisle this falls on. But it's clear that the presidential election will probably be determined by no more than 4 states in America. And if you're a resident of Pennsylvania or Michigan or Georgia or Wisconsin, God help you now between now and November election, because you're going to see a tremendous amount of political ads.
Yeah, and that's where the national election is going to be decided, right,
Yes.
in 4 or 5 states.
Without question.
And with a margin that's probably 1% or 2 difference, one way or the other.
I don't think you should look at it with an outcome. The only thing that would change the percentage would be the potential at additional third-party splits.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting for sure, and we don't pick a horse at AdvaMed on who we're for or who we're against, but we do want somebody that will lead from a sort of a nonpartisan, bipartisan basis as much as they can to get just positive outcomes for the American people, particularly in the healthcare space, right? Yeah.
It really is making us look at our global partners that have coalition governments
Yeah.
and say, maybe this isn't that bad.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, good. Well, let's switch out of politics and talk leadership a little bit. You've been a leader in the House. You've been a leader in the Senate as well. Talk about your leadership from the perspective of leading committees and leading colleagues in Congress and leading a state. And then talk a little bit about the leaders you've seen who have come in from the business community and how you've engaged with them and who really stands apart from others.
Let me just say this, leadership on the Hill and leadership in business, there's no difference.
Yep.
Leaders are those that inspire others to respond to the challenge.
Yeah.
And historically, I found, as you did, athletics to play a huge part of that, that people on the field respected you when you gave it 110%, and they quickly determined when you gave 80%.
Yeah.
And they didn't appreciate the 80%. And it doesn't mean that they always performed at 100%, but they could be motivated to do it. And I think leadership is about motivating others to excel at what you've asked them to do. That's what I did with committees on the Hill, and you do that through 3 specific things: transparency, inclusion, and example. I never asked anybody to do something I could do myself, and I always made sure that I never did it alone. I always invited others to join in. And to me, that was a smart thing because it let me know where my base of support was.
Yeah.
Therefore, it also gave me a sense of where my challenges were, and I could begin to work on them much earlier. I will tell you that I used the same template as the longest serving member of the House and Senate Intelligence Committee and as my time as intelligence chair, both with the agencies, with the members, and with our friends around the world. So it was not unusual for me to show up in a remote area that nobody had ever been to, where there were U.S. personnel, to spend 2 hours on the ground to have a meal and say thank you. And that was leaving Washington on a Thursday night at 10 o'clock from Dulles, flying somewhere in the world and being back here at 2 o'clock on Monday, and doing it by myself with one staffer.
Wow.
So I've tried to implement the same structure in everything that I do.
Yeah. You've seen a lot of leaders come through your office over the course of the 20-plus years you served in Congress. Many of those business leaders trying to persuade you that what they believe is the right thing to do is the right thing for you to do. Who has stood out, not individually, but the types of leaders who have stood out when you've met with them that have impacted your thinking?
The ones that were programmed to come in and understood that delivering it in a personal way versus a scripted way
Right.
was more effective. In those that would come in, whether they had a presence in North Carolina or whether they were in because of the jurisdiction of issues that I had, I connected better with the ones that really made it a personal conversation.
Yeah.
And I think when you look for people that are being transparent, open, and honest, it's really an easy trait to recognize. And it's the ones that come in that just had to say the 3 paragraphs that they
Right.
were programmed to do, and they really dread the next one they're having to go to.
Right.
You have to question what their passion is about their business's success.
Right.
As I like to say, every CEO visit is not about arm candy.
Yeah. Yeah.
CEO visit is to really pull together the overall strategy about what we as a company need,
Right.
and what we as an association need, and a business sector. And listen, CEOs wouldn't be in the position they are if they didn't have the quality to lead.
Right. Right. Let's talk about young leaders for a minute as well. You've dealt with a lot of young people in your office over the years. You've dealt with a lot of younger people outside of your office, business leaders or aspiring business leaders. Two-part question. What advice would you give young leaders today who are interested in running for Congress or being in politics? And then the second, just a general sense of, given all the challenges we have in the world today, what leadership advice would you give anybody who aspires to be a leader of something?
Yeah. Young folks, I tell them it's really about 3 C's: character, conviction, and commitment. That if you can't convince somebody what you believe, if you can't convince them that you know the difference between right and wrong, and that you're passionate about accomplishing a task, why would they hire you?
Right.
And I said, if you can answer those, then you're competitive in the marketplace. But so is the case when you become a leader within an organization. For those folks that work with you or for you, and I would suggest that you always consider people working with you
Right.
and not for you. They want to know that you're going to steer them in the most credible, honest way, that you know what you're talking about, and more importantly, that if you're asking them to commit, they've got to be committed as well. So I think it holds true for the rest of life. You know, Scott, I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of different people around the world, more so in my intelligence capacity, but I shied away from meeting with the heads of governments and focused more on meeting with the individual where the rubber meets the road.
Right.
The guys that are on the front lines, the guys that are asked to do the impossible. And it was amazing to me that their success really was about how the leadership of their country interacted with them.
Yeah.
That they all had the same qualities, and to some degree they all had the same missions. But their success was in whether they had a leader that was committed to accomplish the task.
Right.
In this particular case, safety of their country.
Right.
So it was always hard for me to leave a place and say, they don't have a prayer of making it.
Right.
But I've also, in hindsight, I get to look back at some of the countries I made the assessment on, and it wasn't 2, 3, 4 years later, the president was all of a sudden in jail for corruption.
Right. Right.
And that's a rampant problem.
It strikes me from knowing you over the years that you did that inside the U.S. government as well. Not just working with the leaders at the top, but working with those people inside the agencies, sometimes deep within the bureaucracy, those who understand policy and regulatory issues well, and made a lot of progress doing that. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair. I never envisioned being in Congress 28 years.
Yeah.
I always looked forward to getting back in the private sector. But I always believed that it was the talent underneath the leadership that I would probably be relying on to work with in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that there are not people like Julie Gerberding, who you and I have talked about, who was CDC director when I was a peon in Congress. But I work side by side with her as a co-chair of a global health initiative today. Many of the folks that were, let's say, underlings in federal agencies then, now are at the top of the list.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really don't have to go through an assessment as to what I think of them.
Right.
Because I've watched their careers blossom.
Right.
And we have a relationship that I can now call on, and hopefully they're receptive because I always treated them just like I did everybody else, with respect.
Yeah. Let's switch gears to healthcare policy, which is something I know you love.
It can be a depressing thing sometimes.
You've led for years on that. I think you and I have talked about this off camera a number of times. The excitement around AI and what that has the potential to mean for healthcare in the future. Talk about that a little bit from your perspective, the biggest challenge you see and the biggest opportunities you see in that space.
Sure. But let me say at the start, I'm sort of like a horse that's been given drugs for the race as it relates to AI.
Yeah.
I have to pull myself back.
Yeah.
5 years ago, Mark Warner and I took the Intelligence Committee, and in the absence of a committee of technology in Congress and an agency of technology in government, we decided we were going to become the Committee of Technology. So it was appropriate because we had a look around the corner. We could see what was coming. Many of these technologies were tried long before they were ever commercialized within intelligence communities around the world. AI is something I've been familiar with, but it's, Scott, when I came to Congress in 1995, the first big legislation that hit the committee was the Telecom Act of 1995. Were we going to tax the internet for sales tax?
Yeah.
And we unanimously agreed that we didn't want to do anything to retard what the internet might grow into because we had no idea.
Right.
Well, we're 29 years later. I have no idea what the internet's going to grow into.
Right.
But we made a decision about 15 years ago we can start taxing this.
Right.
It strikes me that the first response to AI, new technology, is how do we regulate this?
Right.
Versus what is it? What can it do? What should we go out and set up that test what the capabilities are? So, I say to my colleagues often, remember what we decided in 1995. Don't do anything to retard the growth of it, the use of it. 2, spend some time educating yourself about what it is. I think the one thing that I'm amazed at today is that we have no clue, not because we're not engaged or educated, but we have no clue as to how much disruption AI can play.
Yep.
It's going to be huge in healthcare. We know that. And that's from drug discovery to post-approval data that will be valuable to not only the innovator, but to the agency. We also don't know how every sector is yet affected.
Right.
I spend a lot of time, as well as my staff right now, advising higher education. And they rightfully so. They look at it and they say, this is not something we really want to get too close to right now.
Right.
And my response is, oh, you're going to be fully engaged in AI.
Yeah.
Trust me.
Yeah.
And the first thing is going to be, you've got this huge database. Do you sell it? Do you use it? And those decisions are going to set where you go in the future.
Right.
So now's the most important time for you to really reach out and bring people in that know it, and then apply it to how you think this is a revenue stream or an enhancer in your institution. The same is true for a company. A company can start out looking at this as a bench development tool, and all of a sudden get halfway into it and find it's the back half that is really utilized for AI, much more so than it is the front half.
Yeah.
It's going to be different for everybody, and I think we're going to have to develop common definitions about what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I envision that an AI platform is going to be what you and I would have considered to be a game console.
Yeah.
That it sits on a shelf and it's got a name on it, but they all do the same thing.
Right.
and we pull it off the shelf. We're really agnostic as to whose platform it is,
Right.
because they all are basically going to do the same thing. And then we look for somebody who innovates AI tools. And we get a tool that we think is the most appropriate tool for what it is we're trying to do in our business. It's the tool then that is taught. You're using the data to make it learn,
Yeah.
because you're trying to get to a specific destination.
Yeah.
Can I determine X?
Yeah.
I'm more focused on the tools now. I'm also conscious of the fact that we've got to get these definitions ingrained in the system. If not, nobody knows what we're talking about.
Completely agree. I had the same conversation with one of our CEOs recently, and I said to him what you just said. So I'm pleased that you're saying it as well. If we define it wrong, it can be scary to people, and it can retard innovation more than anything else. So to me, definitions are critically important in order to allow innovation to prosper and to keep regulators focused where they should be focused, which is helping facilitate growth in this space in an appropriate way.
The government focus today on use of AI is investigative.
Yeah.
It's against the
Yeah,
applicants.
that's right.
When it ought to be, could we leverage AI to, one, do our reviews faster,
Right.
more thoroughly, and provide more data back to the innovator that we can then decide how do we move forward where it's beneficial to both of us.
Mm-hmm. From where I sit, I see AI benefiting the healthcare system in several different ways, right? One of them is precision in diagnostics, and there's tremendous value, it seems like. The second is early intervention or early therapies, right? And the third to me is this real-time healthcare tracking that goes on in almost all aspects of medtech now and is beginning to see tremendous results, right? How are you progressing in your therapies? Is there any other areas where I've missed that you think, there could be a really strong benefit of AI to help? Because in all three of those categories, and there may be more, the benefit to the healthcare system could be tremendous, because early intervention means better therapies, which means lower costs, which means less chronic disease, which means less cost to the system. Am I seeing that right, and am I missing anything?
I think you're seeing it right. I think what we should be excited on right now would be early detection.
Yeah.
Because early detection gives early therapeutic options.
Yeah.
I think that as we look at the use of AI in the healthcare space, I can say this because I'm older than you. You reach a certain age where you look, everybody you replace, your doctor, your accountant, everything, you're looking for somebody that when you die, they're still going to be alive. You don't want to do this again.
Right.
And we look for a younger doctor because you want somebody that practiced for 6 years, fresh out of med school. They still read the Journal of Medicine. They still read updates. They'll figure out what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
Now, all of a sudden, I'm going, wait a minute.
Yeah.
AI can do that.
Yeah.
I can call in and tell them what's wrong with me. And the likelihood is they're just as good as me sitting down to this young 35-year-old doc that I've got. The comforting thing for doctors or for radiologists or for lab technicians, however we make this transition for certification of whether these AI platforms work, is going to involve a period of time where we do things in parallel. You're not going to throw the doctor out of the office. You're not going to throw the radiologist out of the business of reading film,
Right.
or the lab technician out. But in parallel, we're going to better distinguish, here's what we need a human to do, and here's what we can do through technology. And I would tell you that that parallel period is probably a decade.
Yeah.
So this shouldn't be a threat to people about immediate relocation or dislocation.
Right.
The other comment that I would make would be a larger economic issue. People are using the argument, well, this is going to eliminate a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
I've tried to find the numbers, and I think they're so big that you can't accumulate it. How many jobs were created because of the internet?
Yeah.
Amazon didn't exist. So for those that say AI is too scary for me, geez, how do you like during COVID being able to have your groceries delivered at home,
Yeah.
or to pick them up
Yeah,
and not
that's
have
right.
to shop?
That's right.
Or Grubhub, or having your dinner delivered. These are all results of what was possible because the internet
Right.
created a pathway for it
Yeah.
to happen.
Yeah.
So I look at AI, and I honestly believe AI will create more jobs than individuals are dislocated.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy for a guy from North Carolina to say, because technology was what eliminated every textile job that we had in North Carolina almost. The challenge wasn't that there wasn't a new job they could take. Our challenge was that we had to go from a workforce that had no high school education,
Right.
and we had to teach them how to work on a computer.
Right.
Much bigger challenge that we had back then. The challenge we'll have with AI is minuscule in comparison to what we've already overcome.
Yeah. It strikes me that AI in healthcare is overwhelmingly positive. That certainly there can be a negative downside to it to some degree, but as a general rule, it's overwhelmingly positive if used in the right direction. But you were chair of the Intel committee, and I know you're an optimist and you see the bright side of the world first. But what are the things about AI that concern you and that the government needs to be particularly aware of in order to prevent it becoming a problem for society?
AI by itself is only a threat in the future to our ability to encrypt communications, because encryption can be broken much easier with a combination of AI, but it probably takes quantum computing matched with it. So we're out a decade or more. What AI will facilitate is, I think, a faster pathway for those that want to do nefarious things with gene editing, gene splicing, cell therapy, things that technologically we can already do, but AI might accelerate how we use it and how precise it is. So I'm not sure that it creates new areas of concern, but it does change the urgency with which we look at them. And on a positive side of that same concern, what can be designed to attack can be designed to cure.
Right.
So everything has its therapeutic benefit too.
Yeah. Well, from the theoretical to the practical and the tactical, let's go back to Capitol Hill for a second. We've been working on an issue for a number of years, and you were a leader on it when you were in Congress, called VALID, right? The process to regulate lab tests and diagnostic tools across the board. It's been difficult to get Congress aligned on that, particularly since you've left. What are the prospects, you think, for getting that done in the next year or two, and the value of it to diagnostics and the healthcare system if we do?
Well, there's incredible value. And why should lab-developed tests not be included in the category that's going to benefit from this huge technological shift?
Right.
And the conveniences and the accuracy that it provides. When I look at Congress, I recognize the past problems, and that's disagreements within multiple communities who had pieces of lab-developed tests. What have they learned since I left that we didn't know when I was there? They learned that when government does it by themselves, it can be detrimental to all of them involved. And the FDA certainly put out some proposed regs, and everybody went, oh my gosh, this is awful.
Right.
Well, I'm hopeful, and what I'm telling my colleagues is, don't leave this up to the FDA. You know,
exactly.
Maybe we don't get it perfect. Maybe we only get 85% of the way there. Maybe everybody's upset with a different 10%. But that's very different than an agency implementing something that is purely the jurisdiction of Congress.
Right.
And Congress will have to exercise that authority fairly quickly. If not, the agency will see that Congress didn't do anything, therefore we have the authority to do this, and any attempt to reverse that in court would be influenced by Congress's, you knew this was going to happen and you didn't do something.
Right. Where there's a vacuum of leadership in Congress, agencies almost always step in some form or another. And I remember saying this to a number of folks when you were still in Congress. If you all don't do it now, someone else is going to do it for you, and then it's going to get a lot worse, right? It's not unique to FDA and the VALID Act, right? It happens across the board.
Every day.
In Congress when they don't act and agencies say they're going to do it. To me, that's even more of a reason to act now, not only on this issue VALID, but for Congress to lead, right? And how do we convince people that there's real value in this to the institution and also to the system?
Again, I go back to two words, passion and knowledge. It's education, and it's finding the individuals that understand why they're the only ones that can do this, and that they're committed to stay on this until they get it done. We were close. And looking back on it, I think there were some things that I could have done and probably should have done that may have gotten us across the goal line. But we're dealing with 535 people.
Yeah, right.
And to believe that you can dispel the fears or, quite frankly, the things that aren't factual that are being said,
right.
I hope that everybody that has an interest in this recognizes the fact that to not do this is to put ourselves in a position where we complain about something we let happen,
right,
not something that we did.
Yeah, that's right. It's a lot easier to kill something in Congress than it is to pass something in Congress.
Much
right?
easier. And it is impossible to take something that was done that was a mistake and reverse it, because nothing ever goes away.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of reversing mistakes, there have been a lot of conversations as well on the issue of shortage reporting for medical device companies and the concerns around doing that and getting it right. I think from our perspective, Senator, from the MedTech community's perspective, we already do that and work very closely with FDA in making sure we're reporting shortages. But if Congress passes a bad law that requires us to report things that aren't necessary to report, it can be very costly and very disruptive to the system. And in my view, can cause harm. So there's that side as well, right? You want to make sure Congress doesn't do too much, but you also want to make sure they avoid not doing anything. So what's the balance there, in your opinion, on shortage reporting?
Yeah, the balance is to convey to government, to the American people, what the destination is we're trying to get to. We're trying to make sure that if there is a disruption,
right,
for whatever reason, that government and the American people have been properly notified, and that there is a designated entity that partners with the industry to alleviate the potential shortage.
Right.
And that can be in development of additional manufacturing capabilities. It can be with waivers on import restrictions that may exist. I think one thing you and I probably agree on, and probably your members, is that the marketplace for healthcare is still very global.
Yeah.
And that if we had one takeaway from COVID is we can't rely solely on American manufacturing to supply the globe with a vaccine or a small molecule antiviral.
Right.
It requires a degree of logistics that we just don't think about.
Right.
And so whether it's the COVID challenge of logistics, whether it's the Ukraine-Russia war that's going on and the unbelievable logistic problems that all of a sudden we identified, we have to consider that in the future of how we design this architecture. And whether we're talking healthcare, whether we're talking technology, any issue, I would tell you, Scott, it's probably time for Congress to go back and look at the architecture of government and to figure out, just because we've got X number of branches of government, maybe we don't need all those. Maybe we need some more. Is it really helpful to have an agency that focuses on technology? As I try to say, there's an Office of Technology and Policy, OTPS, I think.
OSTP.
OSTP.
Yeah.
Well, you know, everybody there, their job's important.
Right.
Congress has no idea what they do. Don't even know they exist.
That's so true.
And so I look at all these places, NIST for standards and things like this. Shouldn't we wrap that into something bigger so that there is a voice for, here's where I go for this. Here's what I do. I think that would be helpful to Congress. I think it would be helpful to business around the country. But that's something that only Congress can initiate.
I think from the business perspective, one thing that business always needs more than anything from the government is clarity, consistency, and transparency, right? It's not like we necessarily want more regulation, but if you're going to regulate it, be clear about what you're regulating, right? And what the timelines are and what the process is, and we can deal with it.
You know, there's a reason on the football field the goalpost is in cement. And that's not the case with government.
Yeah, that's definitely right. I want to wrap up on shortage reporting with this. You mentioned supply chain challenges. One of the things that folks in Congress don't fully understand is the difference between the supply chain in medtech and the supply chain, say, for biopharma, right? When you're putting together a complicated piece of medical equipment, you've got hundreds of individual parts coming from a variety of different suppliers. And the complicated nature not only of putting that machine together, but then reporting every potential shortage that could exist in the process of putting that machine together is overwhelming. It's different when you don't have a pill or a biologic.
Sure,
We can tell you this is where we are. But when you're talking about hundreds of component parts, literally, right, that's a very different process and something that Congress really needs to understand before they act on this. So.
I agree with you. And listen, it would be extremely helpful to all businesses for the U.S. to figure out what that future supply chain looks like,
Yeah.
so that companies can begin to plan with lead time versus in reaction to an action that we take that restricts a market.
Yeah, very well said. Let's end on a little lightning round, if we can. So, your favorite, or at least maybe your most influential book you've ever read, or maybe read recently?
Now, 24 years ago, I banned myself from reading books because being on the Intelligence Committee, it was difficult for me to distinguish fact from fiction.
Right.
Unfortunately, I left Congress believing that I could shed myself of my intel duties only to have the director of the CIA call and ask me if he could hold my clearance and treat me as a former director. So I still haven't gotten back in the habit of books, but my wife keeps me thoroughly informed on what she's reading.
Okay. Favorite president, do you have one?
Reagan.
Okay, and why?
Because I thought he displayed leadership in a way that was a model for the rest of us.
Yeah. If you could have, I know you've had great dinners over the course of your career, but if you could have dinner with one person that you've never had dinner with, so that would be dead or alive, I guess, today, who would it be and why would it be?
You know, truthfully, it'd probably be Vladimir Putin. Because I'd love to know how he lives comfortably in the world he's in because nobody else is there.
Mm-hmm.
It's more a curiosity for me to better understand what makes somebody like that tick.
Yeah. If you had to guess, what makes him tick now?
Paranoia, isolation, and power.
Yeah. From where I sit, it looks like power more than anything else, but I'm not as close to it as the former chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee is, so that's fascinating. Your biggest success in your career and then your biggest failure, what are those two things?
I think my biggest success is that I served for 28 years, and when I came here, my kids were in second grade and third grade, and now they're almost 40 years old. They turned out great, and they've produced so far 5 grandchildren. So success is my kids have been successful.
Yeah. What's the biggest regret or the biggest failure you think you had, personally or professionally?
Oh, listen.
And then what can we learn from it? Right.
I think we all have failures. We don't like to always admit them. But I think that we all have a responsibility to give back.
Yeah.
And I think there were times where I've made a decision that either personal challenges or personal ambition or something enabled me to say no when I should have said yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I regret doing that because there may be one person that didn't see the example of giving back that I lost.
Right.
And I don't think we can lose any going forward.
Yeah. It's a great answer. In your defense, right, you had a lot of people asking for a lot of things. And so I'm sure you gave back a lot over the course of your career, but there are always one or two that you miss. And
we've always got an opportunity to do better.
Right.
And that's what I saw out of retirement, is that I can do better, and I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, well, great. Let me wrap up just with this. Talk a little bit about what you're doing now. Obviously, you've left the Senate, and you've got many exciting years of work ahead of you. So talk about your current work and what makes you excited.
Well, I'm excited because I've had an opportunity to get that look out for the next decade. And I'm excited because I've been given an opportunity to be on the field playing and not just in the grandstands to watch. North Carolina was extremely kind to me because they gave me an education that I couldn't have gotten at any institution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in multiple fields on multiple things. And because I'm with a global law firm, even though I'm not a lawyer, I've had to figure out what makes lawyers tick.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I'm there yet. But it gives me a landscape to play in all the fields that I was passionate about. Healthcare, national security, to be a thought leader in emerging areas, which not too many businesses would give me the opportunity to play that role. But I can play it because the company, the firm invested in AI and invested in cybersecurity, invested in national security, things that you wouldn't typically think of in a law firm.
Right.
And Scott, what I've found in the year that I've been there is a tremendous bench of assets that really aren't legal assets. They're assets to, I think, the outreach that we're trying to do for clients to Capitol Hill, to the executive branch. They're assets that address appropriations and government contracts and things. I'm in the process of being able to assemble a plug-and-play team that, depending upon what a client's needs are, we've got the expertise to plug somebody new for that specific issue. I don't have to go outside. You don't have to hire a third party.
Right.
So one-stop shopping, I think, is something we're trying to get the menu legible for clients to understand.
Yeah. Well, that's great, and we're grateful to be working with you here at AdvaMed. I will say, during your 20-plus years in Congress, you were always one of the most enjoyable people to work with, I think, for two reasons. One, because you have your engaging personality and your friendly nature, but also the depth of knowledge that you had on issues, which was often different than many of the people we talked to. And one of the reasons we like having a continued relationship with you is that continues, right? We can rely on you for political advice. We can come to you for policy solutions. We can think about long-term futuristic challenges that we have for this industry. You know this industry well. You've always been a great friend of the industry and the value it provides. So congratulations on a great career. And it's going to be exciting to work with you in this next step of your career because I know we'll benefit from it.
Well, I really thank you, and I thank the membership for allowing you to be leader of this organization, and more importantly, with the freedom to put together multiple types of teams. I think that, the one thing that I would end on is that Capitol Hill's become very complicated.
Yeah.
And I know from a standpoint of a business board, let's say you've got 12 board members, each one of those board members brings to the meeting a different view of what they see inside the window because each one of them looks through a different window at that particular business. That's very valuable to a CEO. What Congress has become is it's the same room, but if we limit ourselves to looking through one window, we really don't see everything that's happening in the room. And I think what we're trying to provide is a third-party view of that same room. And we may interpret it differently, and that starts debate, which is good.
Yeah, that's great. What a great way to end it, great way to explain the challenges we have. And thank you for taking time to come on to the MedTech POV podcast. And from Washington, that's it. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks again for tuning in to the MedTech POV podcast. For more episodes, visit advamed.org/podcast or subscribe to MedTech POV on your favorite streaming platform.